You are watching Omnis Protocol. I am Charles, also known as Omnis, and with me is my rogue support bro, Daimyo Matt. What's going on, Daimyo?
Not too much. Happy to be here. Always love getting a chance to talk to you, so I'm excited.
Well, and you brought the sweet shirt. Like my shirt game, not up to the Matt shirt game at the moment. So
Yeah, if
respect.
anybody ever goes to an event I TO at like a GT level, I'm always wearing the shirt because I'm bright. It's obvious. It's really easy to find me across the room. So this is my TOing shirt.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I had the red hat on at SoCal, and Tyson's partner was like, the red hat made you so much easier to find in this like pool of black shirts and black hats. I was like, oh, Omnis is over there. Cool. I need to go talk to him.
Ah,
We have dinner plans to organize, right? Yeah, picking a bright hat or a bright shirt might make it a lot easier for you to make it to dinner with people because you just they know where you are. But Matt, we don't have to spend too much time shouting out our other show because we're going to be recording that later. So hyped for that. By the way, I'll just mention to you, whenever I miss a week, I miss you guys so much. I feel like it's been a million years since we've recorded.
yeah, but you were off being
Um,
doing actual work, so
yeah. um, yeah. So watchers, we're gonna talk about how much does the mission impact who wins a game. Obviously, I come from Marvel Crisis Protocol, where the crisis or mission is hugely impactful, like massively impactful, and it obviously has an impact. Is my gut reaction, but I'm hoping our discussion, because I know you're a very all of a sudden the phrase that I wanted to use is escape. You're very methodical in your thinking, and so I really trust that you were not the sort of person who's going to come out and just like, I'm just going to say an opinion because I think it's funny. I know that you're going to have thought this out. What's your gut reaction before we dive into this? Does it have an impact? Does it have a large impact? Is it noticeable? What do you think?
I think if you were talking before Never Tell Me the Odds came out, I would say it has an impact, but a very minor impact. I think Never Tell Me the Odds kind of throws a little bit of a mess in all of this just because it makes deployment a little more challenging.
Yeah,
But I'm
okay.
really curious, kind of like you said, I'm not 100% convinced on my own opinion. I have some ideas, so I'm really interested to see where we go with this. So,
Okay, I'm glad we're both in the same spot. We're like, I feel like we're gonna figure out where we land by the end of this, or maybe that we just need to research it more. Um, so starting off, just like from your games, right? Because even at SoCal, there was one point I picked shifting priorities because my opponent brought it, and the mat was marked for shifting priorities, and I wanted to be lazy, which I know you're not as for marked mats, but I was like, sometimes I'm like, I'm kind of comfortable with all of them. Like, obviously, there's a degree of you have to be comfortable playing on all three. There's only three. Do you feel like, yeah, get practice with your list on all three of them? That feels like a no brainer to me.
oh yeah, absolutely. If you're going to be preparing, you even though obviously you're picking the mission pack that you think works best for your list, you have to be prepared for all options.
Yeah. I think if I were to add to it at all, it kind of feels like if there was one to practice more on, it's probably Never Tell Me the Odds because it has the more weird situations.
That and also it's the most recent one, so naturally you as a player have just gotten less games most likely on Never Tell Me the Odds.
Yeah, that's fair. Like as I came back to the game, it was fairly fresh, and so I like played like a game of shifting priorities, and then I played a lot of Never Tell Me the Odds. Just trying to like get it absorbed, and I'm still not sure if I love or hate that mission pack. It could be either.
I've been on that same roller coaster with it, so
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle, but also i- it's so weird sometimes. But okay, well let's talk about the individual mission packs a bit. Um, Shifting priorities, right? Like obviously it hit a time period where it was the only one and people were sick of it, and then Sabotage comes out. But then as I was coming back to the game, a lot of people were like, man, separatists are really brutal on shifting priorities, their ability to just get all over the middle, and the same with Iden. Um, it still might be my favorite overall to just play games on. What do you think? Like, do you think taking shifting priorities because you're the most comfortable with it puts you at a risk against teams like Aiden and like the Kalani Kraken sort of lists? Like, what are your thoughts there?
I mean, the only reason I don't think it puts you in a big situation or a big risk with those is obviously they're going to be bringing shifting. So if they win the die roll, in theory 50-50, you're playing shifting anyway. But even if
Yeah.
you're bringing it, the assumption then is you're comfortable with your list's ability to perform on shifting. I know for me, it's kind of my default starting point. If I start putting a list together, I think about mission kind of second. And the first mission, I'm always like, all right, is this a shifting list? Probably. I think most lists play pretty well into shifting. That's always my jumping on point. And just obviously, yeah, look, separatists are going to have those quick explosive turns. Any faction or models that have the ability to get a lot of quick early movement, they're going to absolutely probably potentially run away with struggle one.
Yeah, so with that thought, obviously, like, so we roughly agree that at least there's some degree of advantage for those teams on shifting priorities. But struggle one giving you 3 middle points to fight over, it still gives you some multiple directions, right? Like it's in that situation, like you still are going to have supports, up on the midline, which are very killable. Um, do you think it? I mean, I want to like go hard stats rise. It's not like we can be like, oh yeah, they have a 55% to 45% disadvantage, or maybe you've already calculated everything and you know the answer to that. Um, but do you feel like, at least for me, I mean, I guess I'll go out and limb here a little bit. And I think I always feel like playing shifting priorities. I feel like I always have play because you start off with more points. I always feel like I have an out and have a way to potentially swing that struggle. And I played the local tournament a few weeks back. I had to play into Aiden on shifting priorities, and it went Aiden Shatterpoint. It was his first two activations. It was rough,
Yeah.
but I still came back from it. Do you feel like that's the case with shifting priority, or do you think I'm imagining things?
No, I mean, I think one of the most insightful things you said was about supports, because if you think about it compared to, let's just use sabotage, because for a while those were our options. Sabotage, yeah, there are 6 active objectives, but really at a core element, you're fighting over those 2 middle ones. And obviously, you said with shifting, it's 3 middle objectives. They're a little bit closer together so you can connect them easier. And yeah, you have to throw potentially really fragile units up onto those middle points and either hope you're hunkered in well or you win some dice roll. But absolutely, I think that is a big factor when looking at shifting. But I agree with what you said with shifting overall, because there are more objectives you're not just starting with. I think you have a better chance to make a big play. Your individual turns can be more impactful because there's more points to easily contest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we're on the same page there. All right, well, let's talk about sabotage. Obviously, this was one I can't when it came out. I got like one game in with it before I took a long break. Kind of came back to the game, and it seemed like every event was like 85% sabotage or something. And I'm totally pulling that number out of my ass. But it seemed like everybody was like, "This is the one to play," because it kind of locks in the third pick, which people felt like it benefited the the person who loses struggle one, that they could lose struggle two and not get trapped into a bad situation um more often. But at the same time, it also seemed to like favor certain kind of lists a bit, and maybe had some games that don't go to struggle three just because they're able to back it. How much impact do you think that sabotage ends up having on who wins a game?
Well, so I think you're absolutely right. It was kind of the big thing for a while, right? It was the big mission. I think also people were gravitating more towards sabotage because you have that Shatterpoint ability, which I think is just
Yeah.
a cool extra feature. And people are like, well, yeah, I'm getting something bonus. Granted, so is your opponent, but obviously you hope that me getting the same bonus, I'm going to be able to do better work with it. I think it definitely impacts the game, but more to what you said at the end, where sabotage not getting a choice on that third card definitely, at least in my opinion, and always my take going into sabotage, is it matters a lot less. I mean, obviously, winning struggles matter a lot overall, but I don't feel as bad if I'm good if I know I'm going to like lose struggle two, and I can feel that way on other missions where yeah, I won struggle one, and I'm like, all right, maybe I really need to push for something on struggle two. try to just close it out here. But if I'm looking at something like Sabotage, I might go, all right, I'm not going to get, screwed up potentially with two bad options. I guess obviously you can get one bad option, but they're a little more predictable because there's only three total versus six options. I think it does make a little difference in the decision making. I overall think Sabotage is a little bit more player friendly because again, you're fighting over less points early, and the points are a little bit more. I guess they're somewhat closer. The overall area you have to cover is smaller, which I think makes it a little bit more new player friendly. But yeah, overall, I wouldn't really be able to say it. I don't know. I'm trying to think back on
Yeah.
how much I think it's going to matter.
I mean, I obviously chose to bring Sabotage as my mission pack to SoCal Open, even though it's probably the mission I think I enjoy the least. Um, I think my decision kind of heavily went around like I just felt like a lot of other people were building for either shifting priorities or never tell me the odds. And I feel like a lot of the time when I would see people pick Sabotage, it was because of that either they just enjoy the Shatterpoint aspect or that nebulous, like, oh, the third struggle is a little bit more locked in. I just feel like this one's more fair. And I just didn't see that much conversation where people are like, I have built this list for Sabotage and I gain an advantage on Sabotage. And I was like, you know what? The stuff I'm playing is actually like pretty good on Sabotage and nobody else is really teching for this. Maybe that's the right call. And I only ended up playing one game on Sabotage, but my gut says that it helped me. And it would have potentially been harder playing on, I believe Sarah Cruel had Never Tell Me the Odds, and I think that would have been slightly more difficult at the very least. But I do feel like you should be able to build for Sabotage, like with like a realization that I had a few days before the event was, holy crap, if I activate Leia, she can walk and focus and have herself on one point, and she can move a rebel and give someone a dash, and I can have Ezra on the other point. And both of them have dashes on expertise, and that, well, isn't going to happen all the time. But if I got Leia in a Shatterpoint, I will probably do that. And that can be a tough spot to deal with, right? If you end up getting a secondary and you can't shove me off and you score no additional points, like if you start off just scoring your back points and I start off scoring 4, that can be a huge swing. And so that was my gut. So I feel like you can build for Sabotage, but it still doesn't feel huge. Do you kind of Are you kind of there with me, or do you think I'm off?
No, I mean, I don't know how many lists I would argue really would greatly prefer Sabotage. I think Sabotage is
I agree
just
with that.
every list has agency on Sabotage. I think granted your Hunter Lumi list, I think is a prime example of a list that loves Sabotage because you don't have to shove your supports way up the field. Although granted, you had a great support that loves to run up the field in Fifth Brother. One thing you said that was interesting, and this was kind of my approach when I went to Nova picking Sabotage, was everyone else is probably going to run shifting or never tell me the odds. So I'm going to bring Sabotage so I have potentially more choices. Granted, I was bringing a Hunter list, but like I also brought an Empire list that really doesn't care. Like it's not where it wants to be necessarily in terms of
Yeah.
Sabotage, but it was fine because I know, yeah, the lists that are gonna do well on Sabotage, which is my opinion again, largely Republic type lists. If I get stuck in Sabotage on Republic on Empire, I feel okay about it. So I actually brought Sabotage to have a different option. Also, just I didn't want to bring Never Tell Me the Odds. So
Fair. Okay, well, let's talk about Never Tell Me the Odds. One last thought on Sabotage is I still dislike the losing the 3 middle points, which I think makes the game really interesting. And I feel like only having 2 gets rough. But then we go into Never Tell Me the Odds, which has all sorts of weird layouts, and like your ability to fight over different points is even more challenging. And you can have an X shape to start off with 1 in the middle, which is, in my opinion, like the hardest starting struggle to play on and like find an advantage against an equal skilled opponent. What's your obviously you kind of started off kind of sounding like Never Tell Me the Odds is the one that can have the most swing. Is that still where you're at?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's two aspects to it. The first one being obviously deployment, because if you're going to try to deploy on both your back points, you're splitting your two squads pretty far apart. They're in that, just straight line funnel, because that's the only way you can be on those points, with obviously the exception of having the, advanced deployment units like ISF Rebel Commandos. So that's where I think the big variable. So, like, part one of Never Tell Me the Odds is the deployment aspect. And then, like you said, you have those two outside middle points that are more spread out, and the change from card to card tends to be more dramatic than any other in the amount of movement you have to do. So you really potentially are stuck in a situation where you're like, well, I wasn't planning to go after this point all the way over here, but I have to because it's one of our active objectives in struggle 2. And inevitably that always winds up being the one that gets rolled as the priority every time. So now you really have to overcommit. And not a lot of, I mean, plenty of lists have the ability to pivot like that, but there are plenty of lists that don't. And if you have a list that can't pivot that quickly, or if you have a player who is less experienced, who can't balance quickly that risk reward to pivot, that's going to be a problem.
Well, and even if you have 4 out of 7 of your cards, right, can pivot really heavily, if those 3 that can't pivot really heavily come up first at the
Yeah.
start of Struggle 3, that may be all that it takes. Maybe even 1 or 2 of those to show up. So you have to think about, am I playing a list where my entire list can pivot? Or maybe worst case scenario, you're like, 1 character can't pivot, but I could reserve them, you know? And then you're also trapped in the situation of like, well, I reserved a character and then I get the character that can pivot, but they're also the only one standing on this other point. So I'm just giving up 1 point to go get another one. And how challenging that can be. I definitely think I still have a lot more room to like wrap my head fully around Never Tell Me the Odds because it creates so many different situations. And maybe that's what I find enjoyable about it is it challenges me mentally, but the amount of preparation that someone puts into playing on Never Tell Me the Odds, that to me alone, whether that's the mission pack or that it just requires more practice, it still feels like it can divide players and like determine a game, even if it's 5%.
Well, and then also keep in mind there's the whole aspect of each struggle. You have a different way to get bonus momentum too. Like that's another variable that you have to kind of keep in here, and it's part of your decision making tree. And in my opinion, yeah, if somebody asks me, hey, I need to practice a mission pack, I'm going to tell them shifting or Never Tell Me the Odds, because in my mind, Never Tell Me the Odds and Sabotage are on the two opposite ends of the spectrum, with shifting kind of in the middle. I think it's easier to be a shifting player I think it's easier to be a Never Tell Me the Odds driven list to then pivot to Sabotage Showdown than vice versa. I think if you're a list that's built for Sabotage, it's hard potentially for you to jump all the way out and go do Never Tell Me the Odds.
I will disagree with you to an extent here, um, because going into SoCal, I was building my lists because of the problems that I saw with Never Tell Me the Odds. I was like, because at my first GT, I got totally obliterated in like a third. I win Struggle 1, lose Struggle 2, and I just get blown out in Struggle 3 because I can't move around fast enough. And he does an ultimate Thrawn play. And so I was very much going, okay, with these struggle 3s and like how fast you can potentially win them now with how much more movement there is in the game than when we started in like the first 6 months. Now every list has like a bunch of movement. So I was building for that. And then I kind of accidentally realized I was playing lists that happened to be good on Sabotage as well. So I do think there's some room there, but I can conceptually still see what you're trying to say, which is like there are a lot of things that you build for Never Tell Me the Odds, and then those things don't necessarily translate as well to Sabotage. But I just don't think that's always the case.
I mean, I almost think more the opposite. I think it's more. I think a list that's designed for Never Tell Me the Odds will do better on Sabotage than a list that's designed
Oh,
for
okay.
Sabotage will do on Never Tell Me the Odds. Is more where my
Okay.
feeling is. Like I actually think
I
so.
could I could see that.
And that's kind of where, again, because I think the nature of, but you hit the nail on the head. We're seeing lists, and that most people are bringing lists that have a lot of movement because I think you have to be able to be prepared for all three missions. And I think it just sets, if you, again, if you're not used to it, not practicing it, and not at least thinking about how your list plays on that, you're in a bad position.
Yeah. Okay. So we're maybe we're more eye to eye than I realized. So kind of moving past just the individual struggles, I'm feeling like I'm starting to notice that choosing the struggle based on what the terrain looks like on the table, like when you have a choice, it that is almost a larger factor. Because in my third round at SoCal, the third struggle, we had two objectives up on the slim piece of raised elevation terrain where you could have one person stand and then nobody else can stand there. 2 out of 3 were on those sort of, and like that's a huge deal, and that can have a huge impact. And so like my gut says that uh, choosing based on the terrain layout may be more significant. Are you seeing that at all, or you just hasn't come up for you?
It hasn't come up that it would impact the decision I'm making when, like, so I win the priority roll, I'm picking my objective or my opponent's. It hasn't been that bad. It can come up a little bit. I almost think even more for deployment. Where it has impacted me the most is, in my Nova finals against Evil Houdini, Scott, he was bringing Never Tell Me the Odds. I had Sabotage. So I knew the priority roll was good. We agreed before the game. He's a local guy to me. We both said the priority roll is probably going to decide this game because I don't want to play on Never Tell Me the Odds. And looking at how the terrain was, there was one side of the table where you couldn't even, unless you had an extra deployment unit, you couldn't have deployed on one of the objectives. So of course, Scott wins the roll. It took us 3 rolls because we kept tying. He picks Never Tell
Yeah.
Me the Odds. He puts me on that table side. I can only deploy on one of my back 2 objectives. And of course, we flip a card where that's not the active objective either. So I started the game off with no objectives immediately on my
Yeah, that
back heel.
Yeah, that also came up at SoCal where my third round opponent, Ghost Bear, won the priority roll, had Never Tell Me the Odds, and because of the terrain layout on my right hand side, I could not deploy. I had to choose to put my unit that had the Rebel Commandos on that side
Mm-hmm.
so that I could do it, but I wanted the Rebel Commandos on the other side. So I got forced into a matchup situation that I found not as strong, that I think made the game closer just because of where that terrain ended up being. Um,
But to kind
so
of
after
like
the Oh,
wrap
go
it
ahead.
back to your original question of, does it impact the decision making? I don't know if it impacts my decision at turn 0 on what list, or obviously it can. I think it more just has the ability to amplify the weaknesses of your list, or amplify how big of an advantage it is if your opponent gets to pick the mission pack you weren't ready for. Because it can happen, weird deployment things can happen on Sabotage, on shifting as well. So if you're already stuck in a mission pack you weren't ideally looking to play, and then you got put in a bad situation, I think it really can just snowball that problem of, this is a mission I'm not as prepared for.
So again, we were kind of talking about this at the beginning that maybe we would come to a realization that we didn't start with, and I think I'm already there where I'm realizing that probably the situation where it would have the most impact isn't necessarily an innate I'm better at this than you are, but after you get to see the table, after you know what your opponent is playing, the person who wins priority is choosing both side and which mission. And it's feeling like, especially as you see more TOs and stuff talking about like wanting to intentionally put terrain in deployment, wanting to intentionally make it so not always scoring, not always being able to score objectives, that's going to be a thing that you manipulate. So maybe from a perspective of, if you want to do that, then maybe going to your choice of, I'm going to choose a mission that I think is less popular so that I have more, when I win priority, I have more ability to choose, like, oh, if I choose this mission pack, it's potentially harder for my opponent. And maybe that is Never Tell Me the Odds. Maybe that's the one that's most likely for you to be able to go, I am going to choose this one because I have priority and the terrain can potentially hurt you because I got to force you onto a side. It's definitely another layer, but I'm realizing that that might be a real thing.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely not something I originally thought about, but I agree. I think it definitely has some impact to kind of this
Hmm.
conversation. It definitely impacts the game.
Interesting. Yeah, that's definitely not where I figured that this was going to end up going, but now I feel like I need to think about it more and definitely take a look. I've got a couple of like small local tournaments this month, so I think that's going to be a thing I'm going to look at, and maybe that will be part of my strategy going into those. Is just can I pick can I pick a struggle mission pack that is maybe less popular, and think about when I win priority if choosing side plus choosing mission pack can lead to some sort of advantage because of the terrain layout. Hmm. Definitely something I'm going to think about more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat now. Now I want to take more of an effort to think about exactly those situations. One thing I always thought was interesting is early on in this game, every talking head, content creator, writer, etc., and I feel like the community at large, the predominant feeling was winning the priority role was bad. And obviously, when you just had shifting, it in theory is bad because most tables, people innately just set them up to be, you know, mirrors of, everything's the same. So I think now that, like you said, TOs are branching out a little bit in table building, we're seeing that overall that people were putting a little bit more terrain. There's a lot of different features. It's not a perfectly symmetrical table. And with the fact that you get to pick the mission pack and table side, I actually think it's kind of interesting that shift. Like, I now want to win priority a lot. I've almost always want to win the priority role because I want to give myself the best possible advantage by combining the mission pack I want and the table side I want in these scenarios. And now I want to take that approach also looking at, like, well, if I pick the other mission pack, maybe my opponents, how does that play with the deployment and the terrain? So that's really interesting as well. But I think we've seen this
And
kind of shift overall.
And maybe that means to lean away from shifting priority. Like I feel like shifting priority might be the hardest one to be like, "Oh, the terrain is going to screw you in some way."
Agreed. I think that's the most generic, the most even keel is shifting.
Yeah. Which might also be why I like it. It could be another reason why to pick it where I'm like, I feel like if we don't end up with some like weird leverage disadvantage one way or another because of a weird terrain layout or a bad case of list chicken, like I feel like I'm totally happy going into like a 50-50 game and be like, I just have to try to outsmart you. And I feel like maybe shifting priority lends itself that way. And like on the opposite side, I don't think I like the fact that Never Tell Me the Odds has that random element of getting an extra score because I feel like it's very hard to control because you're not controlling who you get to activate. So you may go, all right, this is where I'm going to wound Princess Leia because she can't counterattack and it's the perfect time for it. But then you just don't draw a supporting unit. But you're like, I still need to wound her this turn, but I have to activate my secondary. And so there's, to me, that part just ends up being like a random element that may just randomly give someone a point. But maybe do you feel like that's something that you can build around a bit more? Or I mean, maybe it applies to Separatists where you could be like, I could activate Grievous, not wound someone, and then do Appetite for Destruction and have my support wound them. So maybe a list like that has a little bit more control over it.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Separatists will probably have the most control over it. And also, separatists tend to be the people with the most excess force to pay that cost to actually get the momentum when you do it. I think that's absolutely like it's it is just another added element to Never Tell Me the Odds that makes it a little bit more variable. I guess this is a little bit more just my personal experience. I feel like I see more large dramatic comebacks out of nowhere on Never Tell Me the Odds. Maybe that's why it's called Never Tell Me the Odds. But I've definitely, I mean, I've been in the driver's seat of games where I'm like, I don't see how I lose this. And all of a sudden we're in struggle 3 and I'm like, I'm close to losing this game and I don't know where this came from. I don't see that as often because normally, like in shifting and sabotage, when I see those giant swings, it's sabotage somewhat like, yeah, the third flip was really bad, or hey, my opponent made a really great play, or had some really like really spiky dice rolls, or I had a really bad dice roll in one scenario. Never tell me the odds can just, so those are swings in sabotage and shifting that you can see and understand a little bit more. Never tell me the odds feels like it comes out of nowhere. When I, and the same, I've done the opposite where I've been completely felt like I'm completely out of a game, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I conveniently drew the right card that gets me this extra wound, and it's late in this. I'm about to refresh my order deck, so I don't mind spending the fours. Well, now I'm back in the, maybe now I'm pulling the momentum back towards me, and then because
And I
there's so
think I
much
agree
more
with you.
movement, you know.
No, I think you're right. Like I
Oh, I
think
see. You didn't agree. I'm sorry.
no, I think you're on. I think I know that was a lot of people said that about sabotage, right? Where people initially thought sabotage has more comeback potential than shifting priorities. And my gut right now, if I were to rate them, would be that Never Tell Me the Odds has the most comeback potential, Shifting Priorities is the most neutral, and Sabotage has the least comeback potential. That's my feeling in the moment.
And the reason I think that to say least for sabotage also is because there's just less objectives. There's eight, not nine. And
Yeah.
obviously, yeah, like that's only one. And you're like, okay, how much does that really matter? But because you're playing for six out of the gate and you go from six to three, the odds are you're already, look, obviously there's a chance there's the middle one, but at worst case scenario, you've already been thinking about and playing for 2/3 of the active objectives in struggle two at the end of struggle one. So
Yeah.
there's less, yeah, exactly. You said, like, if you're in the driver's seat already, you've already been playing for these objectives, and great, you flipped it. And you're like, okay, cool. Like, I already own two of these. I find that happens a lot in sabotage, where it's like, oh, I already own these two. Great.
No, I hadn't really thought about that until you just said it, but I think you're 100% right. I think there's so much the the need to pivot in sabotage is smaller.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's factual. I don't even think that's an opinion now that we're talking about it. I think you're just naturally already working towards the objectives. Like obviously between struggle 2 and struggle 3 that could be different, but that applies to all of them.
Yeah. And I think the big thing
Interesting.
is, I think in sabotage, the units that have better individual turns tend to shine best in sabotage because they don't have to pivot as much. They have less need for movement. They just need to be able to get onto a point that's already near them and make a big impact right there. Whereas for like shifting and never tell me the odds, a unit that maybe doesn't hit hard can make an impact if it has that ability to, like, well, I can move someone over there and move someone over there and go over here. Like I can, a single model or a single unit has a little bit more ability that isn't just I have to get to a point and impact this point right now with either an attack or a shove or something like that. So I think that's also part of that, the aspect of sabotage where you're not moving as much, so different models do better.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. Well, before we wrap this up, do you have any closing thoughts on this topic before that you just didn't kind of fit into what we were already saying?
Not really. I mean, the biggest thing is, obviously you should be testing all of them. And I love what you said. And I want to think about this now at my next event is I want to focus less on, less on picking the mission that makes the most sense for my list and my opponent's list. But I want to take an extra couple seconds and look at the deployment or look at the board and go, okay, yeah, I'm leaning towards this mission. How do both these missions look if I put them on the table? Like, am I missing something? Is there something that's a little sneaky that I can go, yeah, I'd rather play on my mission, but if I take my opponents, I could put them in a situation where by picking table side, they're going to have crappy deployment or they're going to have a really hard time getting to a certain objective. Like that's something I now want to take a little bit more time because I don't think I do that. Maybe subconsciously, I'm sure somewhere I'm looking at tables going, that could be a weird, terrain feature, but I want to think about it specifically in the turn zero aspect and how I'm making that decision.
It's a lot to absorb, so I don't blame anybody for not having gone into it that deeply because you're already like trying to learn to play your list, trying to like there's a lot to get into already. So yeah, I'm gonna think about it as well. Also go, can I make a team that's very agnostic as far as the mission goes so that I can be flexible and choose more based on the terrain loadout. So yeah, that's something I'm going to think about more. I would say, like, as a closing thought for me, my gut still is that it's not a huge impact. Like, maybe it will come up where there's very, very specific matchups, but where you're like, oh, well, this side definitely wants to play these lists against this person who wants to play these lists. And then how does that, in that specific matchup, does the struggle actually matter? And like, maybe it's ARFs having access to, expose things, and they want to play Dark Troopers, and, how does the layout impact that or something? But my gut still says that it's not very much.
I think if I had to guess numbers on it, if you're talking the difference, if you're talking sabotage and shifting, I would say the list between those two, if you're bringing sabotage and I'm bringing shifting, our list options, whoever wins and picks the missions, I think the mission choice there is probably making a 2 to 4% impact max. I think if it's I'm bringing sabotage and you're bringing never tell me the odds, I think that becomes more of like an potentially even as much as an 8 to 10% like change. I think shifting to never tell me the odds again falls a little bit more in the middle because most people who are bringing shifting are used to that bigger amount of movement. So that's really the big thing for me. And I've seen new players who are more new players in my mind tend to gravitate towards sabotage because it's less objectives, a little more fun things
Less
you get when you
decision
flip
points.
your Shatterpoint. Yeah, and I think newer players will then struggle more going from sabotage to never tell me the odds because they're probably just getting less reps in, and it's a much bigger jump between styles of play.
Yeah, definitely glad they didn't start with sabotage. I think shifting priorities is the better baseline, like, for sure. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
interesting. I'm glad we had this discussion, Matt. We get to talk somewhat weekly, but gotta have a little one-on-one time away from the other
yeah.
boys.
I'll be curious to see because I know they've said that future mission packs they've already talking about one that doesn't have the priority role objective. So I'm really curious to like revisit this conversation whenever we get who knows, that could be 2 years from now we see another mission pack. But I'd be really curious to revisit this without a fourth option in there.
Right, and we've already seen that they're willing to do uh, a mission that has less objectives, right? Because you
Mhm.
only have 8. With, like, what happens if we have one that is 10, right? Or something that has more. We were already talking about how more objectives create more swing potential because you have more of them to think about. And so if they do one that's higher, then there is even more swing potential and even more comeback potential. So we might see more struggle 2, struggle 3 wins if they go, a direction like that in the future, which seems natural. If you do an 8 and a 9, feels like a 10 is in the conversation.
I mean,
So
look, obviously, like MCP can have a ton of objectives, and MCP objectives can move, right? So, like,
yeah.
imagine that if there's a whole nother variable, like an objective can move. That's just a whole level of crazy. I don't know if I want to get into.
Wild dime, yo. All
Let's
right.
move the
Well,
objective.
I think we'll just close things out here. Matt, thank you so much for talking with me. I'm looking forward to our next Rogue Support episode. You're my hero. Any final thoughts or any closing comments from you?
No, this was a ton of fun. I learned a lot. Even I had my thoughts coming in. I even feel like I've learned a lot more than I thought I was going to. So always a fun
Yeah, same.
conversation. Thanks for having me.
100%. All right. It's a YouTube video, so the most OP thing that you can do is like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a comment about how great Matt's shirt is. Later, nerds.